all the other folks who put this on, having run a couple of these on my own, I know that it is a momentous undertaking. So thank you so much for your efforts. And also thank you to the White House. This is a great venue. One of the things we try to do in the different DEF events is kind of have unique venues, take you outside of your normal military environment to help think about things differently. And as you've noticed, we're also here without uniforms. And I found that that really breaks down a lot of the barriers that might exist between different ranks. You know, seeing a star on a collar or a chevron on the collar maybe has some cognitive biases built in there with how you're engaging. Without those psychological cues, you're able to engage a little bit more effectively and freely. So I want to talk to you guys today briefly about self-developed communities. So we're going to go through 3 different case studies, and I'm going to give you some insights into how DEF was developed and kind of the challenges we face and I face as a founder going through that, and how the lessons I've learned through my mistakes and what I've found has been effective in the service. So there's 3 case studies we'll go through. The first is the American Revolution, particularly focusing on Benjamin Franklin's creation of the Junta Group, which was a group of revolutionaries in the 1720s and beyond. The second is the society built in Vietnam by the Vietnam POWs in Hanoi Hilton. And the third are the self-developed communities being created right now across the national security ecosystem, within the Army, within the Navy, within the broader governmental discussion on innovation outside of the DEFxKC. And finally, we'll kind of end up with some of the observations I've had and the challenges we've faced as we've grown. So first, organizations. Self-developed communities are very American in nature. Alexis de Tocqueville, as many of you are familiar with, came to America and did a sociological survey while he was here and discovered that there was a very strong trend of individualism that thrived in America. And yet at the same time, there was also this underlying collectivism. So individuals on the frontiers would come together and help each other out and put up barns and build social organizations and create cohesive structures without a formal structure behind them, because they saw a need to develop that. And then they would evolve those structures as their different circumstances were created. And really, this started in the early 18th century. Benjamin Franklin, who you all know, was a polymath and one of our foremost innovators, and then ended up becoming a very well-known founding father, was a young man who left his home in Boston to start up a company in Philadelphia, went to Britain for a time, and then back to Philadelphia. And as he was starting his professional career, he started to understand the value of networks and people. And so he recruited 12 of his colleagues to join him on an informal discussion group, basically. And these 12 individuals spanned professions. And so what this allowed them to do was to talk about the trends that were shaping their world. Now, most social organizations at the time were for the upper classes, and this was the parties you'd go to and be seen and do the dancing and singing. And so it wasn't really intellectual focused. But with the rise of the middle class in early American history, you saw all of these merchants coming together and trying to learn from each other and find ways to grow their businesses. And so these informal groups, and what Benjamin Franklin ended up calling the Junta, created this foundation for self-organized networks to develop. And some of the things that came out of the Junta in Philadelphia were the first library. So as these men came together, they started realizing that there were a lot of philosophies they had little knowledge of and wanted to delve deeper into. And obviously at the time, books were not in wide production, so you might have had a library of 10 to 15 books in your own library, and you probably had a different book than your friends. So if you were to collectivize all these books together, you could then share your knowledge. And so they created a subscription-based library, which actually endures to this day, but provided the foundation for libraries in America. Additionally, they created the first volunteer fire department. So they saw a need for firefighting to come about, and instead of having the money to pay for a professional force, these men would just sign up for certain times, and they'd respond with the bucket brigade to help society out. And what they found was that by helping themselves out, they were also helping society out. And this is one of the aphorisms that Ben Franklin kind of lived his life by, is if you created organizations and created opportunities that both help yourself out as society, there would be a net benefit for multiple individuals. The Junta was so successful, and although it was semi-secret, he had a lot of people asking to join. They actually spin-off juntas that were created across the colonies. And there was this really strong underlying social network that was created. And you can see the social bonds and the effect this had later on as the American revolutionaries started their war against Britain. This kind of formed the basis for the informal networks that could pass communications between the different colonists, the different parts of the colonies, and create this cohesive whole, even though each of the colonies had individual characteristics that they wanted to belong. So we'll fast forward about 250 years to 1965, when a young man named James Stockdale is flying a naval aircraft over Vietnam and gets shot down and is put into the Hanoi Hilton for 7.5 years, along with about 500 or 600 other Americans during that time. This is a very personal story for me. My great uncle at the time was Colonel David Wynn, Air Force pilot in 1967. He was flying over Vietnam in an F-105 and was shot down. And he spent 5 years in the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam with the likes of Stockdale and Bud Day and them, and had a life-changing experience in many ways. He didn't talk much about it while he was alive, but I was fortunate in that 2 years before he died, and right before I went on one of my first combat deployments, he invited me to come sit with some of his old colleagues from his Minnesota Air National Guard unit. And this, to me, really kind of set in mind this importance of community and how vital people are to any organization. So it's not the hardware that matters. It's not the jets we fly that we'll remember 50 years down the line. It's the people that are in our social group that we maintain contact with over decades that really has a big impact. And so I saw him stand up in front of this group of 50 people, somewhere in their 90s, somewhere in their 60s. They were at all different areas of their time when they were first serving then. But this was the first time he opened up about his experience in Vietnam. And it was heart-wrenching, but also it was really, really powerful to see the bonds that were created in that depraved environment. But Stockdale really was the leader of the Vietnam POWs. And his story is really interesting for those of you who don't know. He was the quintessential naval aviator. You know, he was a test pilot throughout the 1950s. He flew combat aircraft for 20 years prior to going to Vietnam. And right before he went to Vietnam, he got a fellowship through the Navy to study international relations at Stanford. And he was getting along fine. He wasn't too interested in the subject matter, but happened to be wandering past a professor's door of philosophy one day, wanted to start talking to him, and he became enamored of philosophy, specifically the philosophy of Stoicism and Epictetus. And so he and this professor did a deep dive on Epictetus and whole Stoic philosophy. And this ended up being the foundation of what got the Vietnam POWs through those horrendous years in that prison. And when Stockdale was shot down, he found himself going from a modern 20th century society into what he termed the land of Epictetus. So a place where there was no technology, there was no communication, almost no food, and very little clothing. And he was instrumental to creating a society from that. So imagine 500 aviators in a place where isolation is common, where every day you're being taken for questioning and horrendous torture, when some of your individuals die. How do you create a society among them? And what he realized was that the bonds between people are the things that can keep people from standing. Allowing people grace, allowing people the opportunity to abide by certain rules and restrictions that are established based on the foundations of the environments created were critical. One of the first things he would do when a new prisoner would come into the environment is he would get them networked into the communication network. So oftentimes they'd be put in isolation, but they would also be next to another cell. So many of you are probably familiar with the Kafka, but it's a way to communicate individual letters, like Morse code, but a little bit different, a little easier to understand through a matrix. And as you did this, you become very well versed in how to use these tapping through the wall to communicate very complex messages in pretty rapid time. You could probably send, a 2 or 3 sentence phrase across the prison in a matter of half an hour with the rapidity of do this. But this was a way to keep the community cohesive. And what was really critical about this is if you look back to the POWs who were taken in Korea, many of them had horrible psychological challenges afterwards. Maybe brainwashed by the communists or not, but many of them turned on the America that they had chosen to defend and made denouncing statements. Well, in the Vietnam prison, this was almost non-existent. It did happen. There were some collaborators, as there are in any challenging environments. But for the most part, every single American stayed within this cohesive fold. And so this network of individuals, of people, developed in the most arduous environment, created this society that allowed them to all return with honor in 1973. And they have one of the lowest rates of PTSD of any group in combat ever. And there are some commentators who make the statement, maybe they're aviators or something like that, but I would contend, and I think this is accurate, it's what Stockdale and his leadership team did in the Vietnam situation that provided a psychological foundation of a strong societal structure that was self-developed outside of societal norms that created the institutions to keep people sane and keep them going forward. So now we fast forward 20 years. So many of us have served in combat overseas on the ground in very ambiguous environments, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And what I've seen is that our generation is one of the most entrepreneurial of any of the service members that have served pilots. There are certainly many stories of heroism in wars past. But what sets our wars apart is that we went into environments that we weren't necessarily trained for. Not because the training we got was bad, it's because we didn't know what to expect. So you see a 24, 26-year-old platoon or company commander having to go into a society where he's been trained to close with and destroy the enemy, and yet his job in that society is to help bring together cultural, religious, political, economic challenges and find ways to build societies from scratch. And this creates a mindset where you have to be entrepreneurial, you have to be innovative, you have to take the tools that you've been given and the resources you have and figure out ways to manage this. And I think the military actually does a phenomenal job when we are overseas at innovation. What's the quote from the German general that Americans never call their doctors because it's so hard to fight, and I'm butchering that. But that's what we do overseas. We get the job done with the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marine Corps. But these entrepreneurial individuals who did incredible things, whether flying over the skies of Afghanistan or in the villages of Iraq, being entrepreneurial on the ground, come back to a very restrictive and bureaucratic environment in the barracks. So where they were overseas making life and death decisions, brought back within a hierarchical structure where their innovative tendencies are repressed and crushed because that's just not how we do business. So what we've seen is this emergence of organizations like the Center for International Maritime Security, which was started by a couple of junior officers of the Navy to talk about maritime security issues across the world, bringing in civilians, bringing in Coast Guard officers, Navy officers, Marine Corps officers, to have a conversation. You see things like the Army Solarium, which I guess was top down, but it's really grassroots of junior officers coming together and giving insights to senior leaders on specific problems that they want to see. Combine this with the innovative trends that are shaping the rest of society with design thinking and other methodologies of looking at the way to solve problems, and you really have a confluence of events that allows for great creativity and opportunity. What's really powerful is for all the bad things all the challenges we have in the services, the fact that we are free to self-assemble, organize, and talk about whatever we want is incredible when you look at what other militaries in the world have to face. The things that I've written, the organizations that I've helped start, the organizations that you guys are starting would never be allowed in almost any other military in the world. They are even more hierarchical and structure-driven than we are. And so we have that freedom to push against bureaucracy, to have these raucous conversations and raucous satire, things like the Duffel blog and Terminal Lance, to push back against the establishment. And while this irreverence may seem uncouth to those in senior leadership, it really gives, one, a release, but also an opportunity to be creative and innovative. And so I see real power in this generation and the ability to take the lessons we've learned in the crucible of overseas deployments, applying them, and as we grow into leadership positions, whether it be civilian or military, having an outsized impact. So the type of teaching that Mr. Vandegrift is doing is phenomenal. And I think it's that type of experiential learning is spreading. And as we see gentlemen like Colonel Taylor being promoted and, potentially at the flight range one day, he's going to inherently push that innovative mindset to his battalion commanders and his company commanders and platoon commanders. Just like modern mates of mine who are now COs are empowering their department heads to get their division officers and their junior enlisted to start thinking about innovative opportunities. There's a unique program called the Athena Project run by Lieutenant Commander Dave Nobles, who was on the USS Benfold. And what he did was convince his commanding officer, Commander Richard Baran, to let his ship once a quarter go to a brewery in San Diego. No uniforms, anybody can pitch any idea, and the commanding officer and a team of 2 other department heads will vote on the best pitch. And when that pitch is the winning pitch, will get time and resources to implement that on the ship. So it really empowers these junior enlisted and junior officers, if they see a need to change, to give them the opportunity to do so, and to take some of those undirected complaints and put them into useful focus. I forget who it was. I think it was Steve who was talking about if you have a complaint, you should always have a solution. I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I think a lot of the complaints we hear are from individuals' possible solutions thereof. They don't know what the outlet is. And for me, a complaint is really a canary in the coal mine. It's saying this is something I should be paying attention to. There might be 100 complaints, and 10 of them might be valuable, but it's a data point that you as a leader should take. And if there's a way to empower that individual who's a constant complainer and whiner and put that into a useful way, you should find ways to do that, because that person might just be frustrated and depressed and not have the resources or the means to actually execute or have an idea. If you give them the means to think of ideas and give them, hey, okay, I want you to be in charge of this particular program. Here's the bounds with which you can operate, but within that bounds, do something creative with it. Something might happen. Yeah. There's always going to be those folks who are just going to be the whiners and bitches and complainers you can't do anything about. Those are good people to ignore. But you have to work through this with everybody. Because I've seen that some of the youngest people, they come, one of the things we do in naval aviation, which I really dislike, is the first thing we tell a new pilot that comes in is shut up, new guy, don't talk for 6 months. And I think what that does is puts the mindset that younger people and the new guys aren't valued. And people coming from one command to another are often told, don't tell me what the last command did, we're different. Well, I would argue some of the most valuable insights can be from those people who are just introduced to a new environment. So say you're a department head, you just took into your new squadron, you had some experience, and you come into a squadron and see something wrong immediately. They've been doing it this way for 10 years, they're acclimated to that process. You as that new person, as the commanding officer of that new person, have probably a 1 week window to capture that really good insight and institute change if you can get that smart early. So one of the first interest interviews I would contend you should do as a senior leader with a new person is there anything in my command that you see different than a command leader in the past that you might be able to do better? And that instantaneous introduction of a new idea might transform something. You don't have to execute on an idea, but at least it gives you a new data point to look at a problem. After 3 months, they'll be acclimated to the new culture, and they won't be able to bring those insights back from that different culture into your own. But it's a way to constantly reinvent yourself and look at ways to change. So again, I think there's immense opportunity, and I'll put another pitch in for the Agora. One of the things we're trying to do with DEF is create these small pockets of innovators throughout the country. And I think the valuable thing about that is, Damien, you're leaving here shortly, and all of you who are in school here are going to leave within the next year or two. When you go to your next duty station, you're going to have to either start over and make new friends, and have old friends. But we want to create a network of innovation so that when you go to whatever new duty station, you have a group of 5, 10, 15, 20 folks who already think like you do, who are already trying to push the bounds and have a ready network to tap into to do great things with. So as the Agora develops here, this can be a place where you guys can continue to push your ideas forward. So my last point. So those are the 3 communities. I'm a big fan of networking community. More important than technology is the human aspect. But what we've learned from DEF. So one of the books I'd recommend if you have any inkling of being entrepreneurial is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. So Ben Horowitz is a phenomenal entrepreneur, Silicon Valley scion. His book is probably the most honest assessment I've ever read about what it's like to be an entrepreneur. He was a tech guy in the late 90s, running a very successful startup that hit the tech boom, and his company collapsed. And it talks about him guiding that team through the hardest days of the tech boom collapse and what it really meant to be a CEO. And he talked about this thing called the struggle. It's all capital T, capital S. And it's something you don't understand until you've actually been there. And I read this book probably 6 to 8 months ago. And, okay, fine, you understand it. I really didn't get that until I was running this organization in a meaningful way. There are so many things that come up on a day-to-day basis, whether it be a discussion blog post that suddenly blows up and you have a crisis on your hands, or it's just you're not seeing any traction on what you're doing and trying to move the needle on something and you want to give up, or you spent months and months on a project, it's not making any progress, you still believe in it, but you're not sure if you should drop it or not. Like, those are the deep moments. I can't tell you how many times in the past 3 years I have honestly just thought about quitting DEF. I'm just being like, this is too hard, it's not worth it. Nobody cares anymore. We're getting spears from all these high-level people, even low-level people. I'm just a rabble-rouse who has no solutions. That stuff is hard to take. But Ben Horowitz is able to write about it in an incredibly tangible way that just is incredible. So highly recommend it. But what I've learned is that you have to it's great. We hear about great all the time. You have to just push through. And, I look at some of the stuff we've done with the Casino Raptor Innovation Cell, which is an official organization in the Navy that does innovation. And about February, I think it was the nadir of our organization. We had been around for 2 years. We were trying to find our identity. We had some cool products going on, but the group was just falling apart. And I've been talking to Adam Grant, who's a Wharton professor. He's writing a book on innovation. And I sent him an email because he's going to do a story on the CRIP. And he said, what's the biggest challenge you face? And I said, I honestly don't think we're going to be around in a year. I think that we've done some good things, but we just haven't found a way to institutionalize ourselves. And so right at the bottom point, a month later, we heard the Secretary of the Navy is now launching task force innovation. We heard they stood up a whole senior working group of innovators. Secretary of Defense just announced this week they're setting up an outpost in Silicon Valley to create relationships among individuals. Well, that was a direct outpouring from a meeting that the two of us had in Silicon Valley a year and a half ago with Pete Newell at the MNT, which you mentioned earlier, and Deke Slayton, who was an F-18 guy now who's a Hoover fellow. They said it's all about relationships. DoD hasn't done that. So Josh and I created a white paper. Josh did most of it. And Josh has been shopping around the Pentagon for the past 8 months. Remember, he's a lieutenant, 20-year-old guy. He found the right people, and now got Secretary Carter. He's starting to setting up a whole new cell of innovators in Silicon Valley. So all of a sudden, when we're at the bottom of we think we can't make a difference, this is blowing up across the entire DoD ecosystem. So it's almost that patience thing. And I talked to Micah Murphy, who's another DEF board member. He's in the CNO's studies group. He said we are so overwhelmed with innovation right now. It's saturation by innovation. I can't even move. And to me, that's actually a big success in that 3 years ago, who would have thought that the highest level of the Pentagon would have been overwhelmed with talk of innovation and creativity? Now, there's definitely a difference between talk and action, and the action part has to come. But we're making a difference. There is this groundswell of desire to see changes. You see Senator McCain, you see Secretary Carter, you see ASN Garcia, you see CNP, Chief of Naval Personnel, Admiral Ag, talking about personnel reform, changing our 20th century model to something in the 21st century, General Brown. All these conversations that have gone on for the past 10 years are coming to a head, and differences are being made because of people like you doing incredible things, advocating for the things that you see changes need to be made out there. So I'm incredibly optimistic now. I mean, it's amazing how much difference 2 months can make as we go forward. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. I've been talking for about 20 minutes, and that's about the limit of what I like to chat about. But I'd love to take questions. I know we're getting late. I'm between you and the beer, so it's always a hard time as the speaker. But you know, I'm here as a resource. I'd love to help you guys out. Hopefully, I'll be part of that Silicon Valley reserve effort when I go out there for graduate school. And I'd love to be a resource for anything you guys are doing out there. But yeah, happy to answer any questions about that, about the origins.
What's the future? 5 years from now, where's DEF?
Yeah, so that's a great question. DEF may not exist in 5 years. And I say that because if our mission is accomplished, we may not need to be around. Additionally, one of the challenges of bureaucracy or of organizations is all of them grow. And all of them create a tribal mentality. And we're almost seeing this on the discussion board. Some of you have probably seen discussion. People are feeling that we have become insular, and that's something I try to fight against. But somebody even accused us of carrying water from the status quo, which I'm blown away with. No one's ever said DEF is carrying water from the status quo. Like we are the ones who are pushing the envelope. But you do create these insular cliques. And what I would hate to see happen is that DEF becomes the place where the innovators are. And if you're not innovator enough, you're not part of the group. Or if you have a divergent idea that's so divergent it's outside our divergence, then you're not part of our group. That's complete antithesis of what this is about. And so any organization has to fight against that. And I think innovation organizations probably need to disband after a couple of years. And then the people who are part of that can form their own organizations. Now, that said, there may be value in DEF. So DEF may be like TED, where we have we're a convened place. We're not creating policy, we're creating a foundation, a place for people to come and interact with each other. That's why DEFx and DEFagora, I think, are so important to push that out there. But that's something we have to think about hard. But I kind of like having a directionless future. We were created on a whim because we saw a need to fulfill a need. And I like kind of being able to go where opportunity is. So we'll see. Yeah.
Kind of the path you've been on from founder up to now, if you could go back and redo a couple things or do some things back then that with hindsight differently, what would those be?
Yeah. I think I would try to get a little bit more service diversity earlier on. We were, for a while, pegged as a Navy organization, and then now I think it's almost swung to an Army organization. Must be all credit. You guys have definitely been in the forefront of taking leadership roles. But just finding a way to tap into the non-military networks related to national security. So one of the best speakers I think we had last year at DEF 2015 was a young woman who's a pacifist. And she came and she talked about nonviolent solutions to national security problems. And when was the last defense conference you went to that had a pacifist on the stage? 26-year-old, no less. But I think having those divergent perspectives, and she was very well spoken, and you could hear a pin drop in that room when she was done. And a lot of people didn't agree with what she was saying, but she made a very compelling case. And those are the type of diversity things I wish I brought in early. Really more people on the Hill. Bringing in the congressional staffers, bringing in the policymakers, the think tank folks, not just the military. And one of the things that I've come to realize on national security is we in the military see everything as a military solution. We are one small tool in the national security toolbox, and often a tool used too often. We have a very specific role, we do it very well, but there are also tons of other capabilities that are complementary to ours that may provide better solutions in the long run. So a way to tie in, USAID or some of these more nonprofit organizations that we better. Additionally, I think our innovation competitions for the first couple of years have been a little bit weak. For us, it was a win just to get people to pitch ideas, regardless of what the veracity was. But there's providing a resource for military officers with no pitching experience to go through a 2-day seminar from business school professors who do all the time. How do you make a compelling pitch to get funding from somebody? And we see this all the time from young people in the civilian world, but we are not trained to pitch ideas because it's not our role. We are there to pursue the mission. But that could have been something we could have done. That's your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, David.
Right. So one of the things that Def does is it runs the blog shop. So I think it's a fantastic resource. I don't know if you just talk a little bit about it, because for me, I can talk and interview, I can take pictures, but when it comes to writing, there's this resistance within me.
Yeah.
It's part of this whole be seen, not heard culture that we have, and it's like if you can break the seal, it seems like you turn to Joe Biley when you're coaching all the time, reduction man. You have to get the first one out.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you talk about that.
So the blog shop was conceived of and created by Joe Biley, and I think to me it exemplifies what DEF is all about: providing a platform for people to take an idea and have resources and support to execute on it. His idea was to get 10 to 12 mentors of prolific military writers to help aspiring first-time writers get their first piece published. And so if you have an idea, you're thinking about something you want to have published, you'll email him, he'll set you up with a mentor, he'll go through the first draft of it, and we'll get you placed in a small word journal or a DEF whiteboard or SimSec or The Bridge to have you publish and get it out there. It hasn't been successfully wanted. We probably only have like 2 or 3 submissions. The resource is still available. That's another thing, lesson learned is failure happens and you have to be willing to accept it, but still try new things, because the one thing that does work will work eventually. But I'm not going to answer the question directly in the following statement, but I think it's important to say is that writing, as Steve mentioned, is one of the most powerful ways that you have to make a difference in the conversation, especially as a young person. And I was having this conversation with a close friend of mine 2 weeks ago. He said, how do I, as a mid-level officer with no influence, no resources, and no connections, get my view in the conversation and no technical skills? The thing I said to him was write. Just write one article. Write your first article. Like just whatever's on your mind, you're in your office, you're frustrated about. Write an article. We'll get published. And he wrote this phenomenal article, which hopefully will be published this week, and it's hilarious because he's a funny guy, about how many computer systems he has to go to check his record. The Navy is just absolutely atrocious. My awards are on one thing, they got to get verified by 2 other systems. They don't link to my personnel file, which are all unsearchable PDFs, which don't